Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and today I'm going to be taking you through a brief overview of the offerings that the custom set Hyperpop has for the custom constructed format Revolution. Quick overview, Hyperpop is a custom set based around the titular music genre made by Platy people at Ignited X Soul. It's been in development for 2 to 3 years and just recently got into the format being Revolution, which is a custom card constructed format which is based around a standard-esque series of rotations. And Hyperpop is one of the sets that just rotated in, or sorry, it's the only set that just rotated in. But yeah, if you'd like to learn more about either the set or the format, I'll have some links in the description. But assuming that you already have a decent understanding of what each of those is, let's hop into what Hyperpop offers to a custom constructed format. So we're going to start by going over the mechanics and themes of the set and cards from them that kind of are likely to see play, and then I'll go into a more general slew of what are some staples that have come from the set and what are some cool build arounds that I think should draw the eye. So to start off with, we're going to be talking about the mechanic drop. So drop, as seen on Acid Hydra here, is a pseudo ability word that if you didn't cast creature spells on your last turn, you get some sort of effect. And notably it says on your last turn, not on the last turn. So one of the main ways to enable drop is either to alternate it with non-creature spells or paying for activated abilities, or you cast creature spells on your opponent's turn and use it in a tempo-y shell. So the main way you would go about this is building a deck that essentially has like a bunch of, like, let's say planeswalkers and creatures for a mid-range deck, or has a bunch of removal and interactions spliced in here. Acid Hydra is a really cool payoff and illustrates the kind of design that lots of the drop cards have, which is despite drop being really good if you only have a few drop creatures, lots of the drop cards encourage you to run a slew of creatures so that there's an actual choice or tension point. Despite that, Acid Hydra is just really strong on the face of it, being essentially a Green Sun's Zenith staple to a body if you have a drop live. So it's a powerful toolbox build around for a lot of mid-range decks. Now, of course, not all drop cards require you to be running a lot of creatures. Sphinx of the Sound Veins is one of the notable exceptions that allows you to essentially use it as your sole tempo or control top end, playing it on your turn and then immediately also having interaction up, which is really strong for a lot of decks where this can just be your top end that you don't have to worry about tapping out for, because you're going to have room to play spells on your opponent's turn anyways. Now, drop also has a cycle of mythic cards which trigger not only on the drop creature entering, excuse me, but also on any other creature entering. Now, not all of them are playable, but Avatar of the Airwaves is notable for just being really strong and copying powerful ETBs, and it also happens to have an infinite combo with another card in the format. Then you have Avatar of the Festival, which is one of the strongest cards in the format at stabilizing you against aggressive strategies, oftentimes gaining you upwards of it is usually gaining you at least 5 life. On wider boards, it gains you frequently 10 to 12 life on a single proc, and you can keep, because of how drop works, if you have like a token making enchantment or something, you can keep triggering the drop on turns after the one after you play this, and therefore making it so that if your opponent doesn't have the opportunity to alpha strike you, you can just keep resetting your life total. Avatar of the Rave is also pretty powerful, allowing you to recur interaction or other threats when you play it, and just serving as a really powerful top end in its own right. So drop is usually there for either tempo-y decks that are going to be running a lot of non-creatures, or mid-range shells that make concessions to their threat suite in order to enable these sort of powerful back-breaking top-end creatures. The next mechanic is at the complete opposite end of the speed spectrum. It's Amp It Up. So Amp It Up is when you cast your second spell each turn, or when you attack with 3 or more creatures. And this is obviously like a very low to the ground mechanic. As you can see from Breakbot here, you can very quickly and aggressively curve out your creatures to grow them into monstrous threats in their own right. And so it has applications for both aggro, with cards like Spin Master here, which can become a wholesale 3/3 if you amp it up twice in a turn. Or you can use it in Tempo Shells, which can use cantrips and interaction to get the double spelling and run out like small tokens in order to trigger the 3 or more creatures. There are also some cards in the format which give you huge benefit for amping it up twice. For example, for aggro, you have cards like Xeon BPM Savant, who, if you amp it up twice, gives you a monstrous quadrupling to her power, which in combination with, let's say, like combat tricks or something, can really just kill an opponent in a single swing. Meanwhile, for slower or like tempo-y strategies, Real Virtuality offers you a 4 mana extra turn spell if you play a cantrip or a 1 mana threat on the same turn as it, in addition to obviously the filtering on that it gives on its own. So, amping it up, usually your deck really wants to be tight on its curve and gives you big rewards for being able to consistently enable the double spelling or attacking with multiple creatures. Finally, the last mechanic of the set is Prismatic Mana. So Prismatic Mana basically says you can only spend mana that you haven't already spent on this spell to cast this. So for example, for Iterate Procession here, it's a standard non-land removal spell, very strong, just because of its flexibility. But the Prismatic Mana means that you can't play it in white-black, but you can play it in any tricolor combination that includes white-black, which means you can play it in Esper, you can play it in Mardu, and you can play it in Abzan. And you might think that Prismatic Mana, by virtue of being a mechanic that naturally encourages multicolor, is something that you would only see play in slower strategies. But there are cards with it that are good in aggro, for example. Bright Light's Terrier, doing an excellent Selfless Spirit impression at 1 mana, and Sashanki having the ability to combo very strongly with other effects that pump up her power. It's also great in tempo, with stuff like Refract and Flow Prodigy. Again, Flow Prodigy is basically Spectral Sailor for sort of 3-color requirement, and Refract gives you a powerful quench effect that lets you sequence your following interaction with full knowledge of what your opponent has. But of course, also slower decks make use of it, like Control. Make It Personal does a great impression of that one Sultai spell from Tarkir, whose name I can't remember, but I'm sure you all know what I'm talking about, that allows you to steal all of your opponent's spells from the top of their library. But here you can play it in even a Mardu control deck, and having the cost reduction or I guess you would call it like color washing here is really powerful for being able to cast your opponent's bombs for only 3 mana. Meanwhile, Lightvein Purifier makes it so that you have a lot of stabilization, threat, and the ability to just filter through your deck for cards. And some Prismatic Mana spells don't even have a base color that you have to pay for them, like Glitch Chaos Redeemed. You can play Glitch in any 3-color deck that you want. And her abilities are, slightly weaker to compensate, but it means that she has a flexible role in any slower shell that could want a Planeswalker like this. So those are the 3 mechanics of the set. The set also has some non-mechanic themes, mechanical themes, which we're going to go through now. Each of these has a sort of a package of cards that potentially pushes them into viability in Constructed. And the first of these themes is Scrying. Attune District and Cutting Room Floor both allow you to pay 1 whenever you scry. So essentially, as if you pay 1, if you assume that, let's say, Attune District is a 3-drop and Cutting Room Floor is a 2-drop, they each scry 2, and then in Attune District's case, you make a 2/2 Cutting Room Floor, you kill something with 2 toughness. and then you can just keep doing that whenever you scry. And Oath and Hit Squad gives you a way to close out the game by draining your opponent out. Next up is Aristocrats, classic strategy that Hyperpop provides more support for. Of course, if you are going to have greedy decks with the drop and prismatic mana, you're going to want something to punish that, and Aristocrats is one of the best ways to do that. Just pumping out a lot of tokens that naturally synergize with Amp It Up, and then just draining your opponent out of the game before they can do anything. Next up, we have Artifacts. This is a slower, more mid-rangey deck that indexes into a lot of life gain, and then has a lot of engines that can generate card advantage, or just essentially go over the top of what your opponent's doing. I think Artifacts is the most interesting of these because it can play in multiple different ways, as opposed to Aristocrats and Scry, which sort of have prescribed directions that you want to take them, controlling and aggressive respectively. So those are the most important mechanical themes to come out from Hyperpop. So now we're going to go into talking about some of the staples that the set offers. So obviously, if you're playing in an environment that heavily encourages multicolor, the question that comes up is, okay, how am I casting these spells? And the answer is some of the lands that Hyperpop provides. One cycle is the Soundvein cycle, which are essentially monocolored lands that when they ETB, they ETB tapped, but when they ETB, you can pay 1 life, and if you do, you add 1 mana of any color other than the color that they add. So they naturally create some odd sequencing issues if you want to be casting spells with double pips, but otherwise they're really strong for letting you splash either off color or essentially splash colors that are a little more difficult to hit than basically it allows you to splash colors without having to commit fully to a 3-color mana base, let's say. If you do want to commit to a 3-color mana base, though, the set also has tri-lands. So it has a half cycle of tri-lands covering Esper, Grixis, Bant, Jund, and Naya. And each of these are notable because if you pay 4 mana of different colors, you can turn them into pretty strong combat tricks in their own right. So, which, given that lots of these decks are going to be running effects which add 1 mana of any color in order to enable their tricolor cards anyways, isn't that far-fetched. Finally, speaking of 4-color decks, one of the best ways to enable those is with Nascent Lightvein combined with the tri-lands. Nascent Lightvein requires that permanents you control produce 4 or more colors of mana, but if you play a tri-land on 1 and then fetch a basic of the color that isn't on that tri-land, Nascent Lightvein will immediately untap it, so you can have this live as early as turn 2 if your deck is greedy enough. Okay, so going into some non-land staples. So obviously there's some great fixing here, but if you want to be really greedy, you're going to need some ramp. And this set provides one of the best ramp spells we've seen in the format in a long time in Manifest the Lightveins. Manifest the Lightveins is essentially a dork, or turns your land into a dork that adds 2 mana of different colors, which is important. So again, there are definitely, like the Soundveins, it encourages you to play multiple different colors, but makes it more difficult for you to play double pips. But in Manifest, it's just a really strong creature in its own right, being 4/2, a creature with Vigilance, Haste, and Ward 1, and acts as a dork. So you can attack with it and then use it to spend mana. Now, obviously, the downside here is that despite the safety clause, if Enchanted Land would be destroyed, you sacrifice Manifest the Lightning instead. If your opponent has exile removal, edicts, -X/-X effects, your Manifest isn't going to be the only thing that's dying. The land it's attached to will die as well, so you can get 2 for 1 pretty easily. But in exchange for that risk, you get a high reward. Manifest also curves very nicely into Burgeoning Neighborhood, which can either find you important utility lands like creature lands in a pinch, or just serves as double ramp, especially on turn 3 if you're casting it off of Manifest the Lightveins. It's been a while, essentially since the first rotation, that we've had a double ramp spell for 4. So I'm sure that this will encourage and introduce some interesting ramp deck choices here. Next up, for control, we already have 2 4-mana wipes, but despite that, Bring the House Down solidly establishes itself as having its own role. Its unkeyworded Suspend 1 ability allows you to run it out early, force your opponent to suspend their development, and then gives you free reign to, on turn 4, play a win con on an empty board. So, Bring the House Down, while it is punishable for being telegraphed and has issues with its base case costing 5 mana, so creates some awkward sequences if you top deck this on turn 4, for example. The upsides in decks which can run out a powerful win con on turn 4 are pretty high. Next up, we're going to be talking about Lightvein Arrow. This card seems pretty unassuming, being a 2-color Lightning Strike with Scry 1. The thing is, Revolution has not had a Lightning Strike effect basically ever. So we've had a bunch of really good burn spells, but most of those only hit creatures. Lightvein Arrow, having the flexibility of being able to go face, allows a lot more mid-range and control decks, mid-range control, basically aggro, any archetype, to run flexible removal that can also go face and secure you the win. Lightvein Arrow also works well in conjunction with Gleaming Laser, which it does require a tricolor deck, but it gives you powerful burn density, and the War Leader's Helix effect really goes a long way to stabilizing control and mid-range strategies against more aggressive ones. Finally, in terms of removal, Shockwave Purge is really notable for being cheap non-land permanent removal. It does require you to amp it up, but if you're casting one other spell with this, that shouldn't be a huge issue. This card is obviously worse in mid-range decks where you kind of want to be curving out efficiently and having playing onto your curve rather than playing multiple spells of a smaller cost. But in tempo-y, aggressive, or controlling shells that are leveraging cheap removal, Shockwave Purge can really be the difference maker in terms of being able to take out some of the powerful non-creature engines in the format. Okay, so now that we've talked about some staples, let's talk about some build-arounds or attractive bombs that this set offers. First off, we're going to start with a slow ball, which is Journeyed Fiddler. The set in general has a lands with different names theme, but unlike some of the other mechanical themes I talked about, lots of the more limited focused cards don't also get there in Constructed. Journeyed Fiddler is one of the exceptions. Doing a great, you could say Young Pyro impression. I guess not quite the same thing, you're not Xeroxing with this, but especially with the fetch lands that exist in the format, like the Nascent Lightvein that you just saw, and New Divide, you can quickly establish a huge board with Journeyed Fiddler, especially if you're willing to index into cards like what we saw with Burgeoning Neighborhood, that in a pinch can find you either 2 lands or can find you a utility land which would count for a land that doesn't share a name with other lands you control. It being an elemental is also important because there's elemental tribal in the set, which again, usually building towards tribal, unless it's an aggro deck, usually isn't viable. But if you find some incidental payoffs for them being elementals, it can go a long way. Next up, we have Therapy Ascendant Looper, and I love how the name here refers both to looping in the DJ sense and also what she does, which is gives you a second proc of all of your artifacts. So this will give you back artifact creatures as well. So all of your artifact creatures essentially get Undying. But it also makes it so that if you have, let's say, artifacts that sack to draw a card or to sack to have other effects, you can get them back and use them a second time. Or artifacts with good ETBs that you have other ways to sack. And you can keep doing it as long as you have the mana. Now, there aren't any true infinite combos with Farah. You're going to have to play her fairly and remove the loop counters using your own mana. But despite that, she's still a really potent way to get extra value out of lots of what your deck is doing. Next up is Vinette's Freestyle. So we love Conjurer's Closet effects. Everyone loves being able to flicker their cards for value. And Vinette's Freestyle plays into a tempo-y or control-y version of that, where you want to leave your lands up for activated abilities or to cast counter spells on your opponent's turn. And if you do so, Vinette's Freestyle will continue to generate you value by flickering your cheap creatures or just permanents in general, to let you keep going, to let you like press the advantage. A fun thing is that it doesn't say non-land permanent, so you can actually even use Vinette's Freestyle to do a little bit of ramping. On turn 5, cast a 2-mana spell on your turn. Vinette's Freestyle will allow you to go to end, hold up 4 mana for either a 2-mana counterspell plus a 2-mana threat, or even one of the strong 4-mana counterspells in the format, like Rewind, which this set introduces from canon, or Mathemancy, which essentially draws you a card while counterspelling. Speaking of 3-mana enchantment engines, there are none better in the format than Prismatic Mantle. Well, okay, maybe not none better. Let's pull that statement back a little bit. But it is one of the best 3-mana enchantment engines in the format, allowing you to loop your multicolored spells, not just instants or sorceries, but also permanents as well, is insane, especially given the number of strong multicolored and prismatic tools the set introduces. Can you imagine like casting light vein arrows and gleaming lasers off of this to just burn an opponent out? Prismatic Mantle is great in mid-range strategies. It's great in control. It's just a solid engine that asks you to be greedy, and every Magic player loves being greedy. And speaking of prismatic mana bombs, Grand Consonance is the build round to end all build arounds. For 6 mana in 3 colors, you're able to cheat on a bunch of mana if you have a bunch of, like, let's say, other ramp targets, and grab up to a whopping 5 cards for free from your library. Grand Consonance is one of the strongest build rounds to come from the set, and arguably is the thing to be doing as a mid-range top end for a lot of decks. Now, that doesn't mean it isn't punishable, though. The set also introduces some powerful hate bears, like Charlotte, Angel of Reflection, who makes Control's life a living hell with her ability to give herself indestructible, and for lots of the pesky Amp It Up decks or ramp decks, makes it so they can't actually chain spells in the early game by taxing them for each spell that they cast. Sometimes even just taxing them, but straight up preventing them from casting it if they don't have the right mana. She pairs really well with Ozin Inquirer, who comes down earlier on the curve, and whenever you gain life, taxes all of your opponent non-creature spells, which, given that it itself has lifelink, makes it very easy for it to just be a bear that taxes all of your a lifelink bear that taxes all of your opponent's non-creature spells by 1. So going back to some other build arounds, Yeji Resplendent Idol is one of the more interesting ones for Amp It Up. Like we saw previously, lots of Amp It Up is focused on accruing card advantage and killing your opponent, things that are good for both tempo and aggro respectively. But Yeji does a different thing, essentially being a mini Sun Titan, allowing you to recur permanent cards with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield when you Amp It Up. This is great for aristocrats. It's great for like aggro to recover from to recur like bomb creatures that were killed. It's great for like most decks, honestly, just getting back, like we mentioned, nascent light veins and fetches. So Yeji is a solid build round that plays into the strengths of aggro and aristocrats, but also has decent applications in some mid-range shells. Next up, we have Nikaru the Show Stealer. Nikaru is a really interesting card, a kind of straightforwardly powerful planeswalker who generates you card advantage, generates you mana advantage, really wants you to be running him in conjunction with a lot of 2 and 1 drops so that you can get maximum value out of immediately +1ing him and then potentially casting something from the top of your library. And then the ability to, after +1ing twice, -6 for the amp it up, this emblem deals 2 damage to any target, is massive, because it gives you a way to, both in control decks, just keep the board clean, and in mid-range decks, just burn your opponent out quickly, or force what would otherwise be good blocks for your opponent into unfavorable situations. So Nikaru is probably, for slower aggro decks, he's a great aggro top end, and he goes great into other big red strategies. Speaking of big red, let's talk about Underground Sensation. Underground Sensation is a really strong enchantment that gives you constant value and functions sort of like, I forget the name. There's that Assembled Legion, I believe is the name, for the cannon enchantment in red-white for 5 that keeps getting you soldiers. However, Underground Sensation starts to stack really quickly. First it gives you 1 token, then it gives you 2 tokens. Then, after 3 turns after it's been out, not only does it give you 2 more tokens, but it starts doing a mini lightning helix, shooting your opponent or their creatures and gaining you life. So, despite technically being a slow piece of value, Underground Sensation scales incredibly quickly if your opponent doesn't answer it, and is a great threat for lots of mid-range decks that are looking to index into permanents of multiple types, like drop decks and like Grand Consonance decks. Of course, if you're an Underground Sensation, you're always going to lose out to whatever's on the Billboard Hot 100, and in the world of Hyperpop, that's no exception. Top of the charts is a great counter to Underground Sensation and a lot of aggressive strategies, allowing you to, you can choose 0 for this and buff up your tokens, or you can choose 10 and just have all creatures get -1/-1 forever. There's a lot of interesting ways to use this in a deck with creatures, where there are interesting choice points of how you can build around it to make it so that only your creatures get buffed and your opponents don't. But at the end of the day, honestly, this just being 4 mana, all creatures get -1/-1 permanently, is crippling to a lot of strategies, especially stuff that wants to just keep pumping out tokens like Underground Sensation decks, like Amp decks, and so on and so forth. So it's a great sideboard piece, build around card, just a great like anti-meta tool. With that, we've come to the end of cards that I wanted to talk about today, but this is only a small sampling of the wide offerings that Hyperpop has. So there are a few things you can do. I'm going to have a link to the Custom Magic Discord, so you can look in the Revolution channels there and discuss, hey, I'm looking for this type of card, or just talk about the format and deck building in general. I'll be linking to Manifesto, which is our Scryfall-like search engine, so you can do some snooping around of your own if you want to. Over and above both of those, I'm going to be linking 15 sample deck lists in the description that are pick up and play. So if you're looking at this and you're like, I don't want to brew something and I don't know where to start with that, but this card looks really cool and I want to play with it. Not all of the cards here are going to be featured on in those 15 deck lists, obviously, so we talked about way more than 15 cards, but you can find a decent chunk of them there, or you can adapt some of those shells to use cards here. Finally, thank you for watching, and I hope you'll join us. This video is going to be coming out on May 9th. May 11th evening is the submission deadline for the first Grand Prix at which Hyperpop will be legal. So I would love to see some of you there, and if you're interested in signing up for the GP and have questions about how to do so, join the Discord link in the description and we can get you set up with that. But until next time, this is going to be Caillou signing off.